this is Paul Palmer. Today I want to talk about competence. Competence is about demonstrating that you can do what you say you can do, or that you've been trained in the subject that you've been attending a course in. But what does it really mean to somebody? Well, if you consider yourself a professional, an expert, then you're competent in that activity. But what about your team? What about those in the quality team, the manufacturing team, operations, the finance team, the warehouse team, whoever's creating the drugs that you're planning to sell, the whole pharmaceutical company? How do you know that they're actually competent? Well, you look at the key performance indicators. Okay, so that tells you that the company's going in the right direction. But does it mean that the people you're working with are competent? You might have a COO in place that drives the business forward and tells everybody what to do all the time, and the people do it because they're frightened of her, not necessarily because they're competent in the role that they're in. What if you have a manager that tells people what to do, but then when they do it, she changes it? Does that mean that the team she's got working with her are not competent? Or does it mean that the information she communicated to them was inadequate? That what they've done is they've delivered what she asked for, but the communication was poor. That person wasn't competent in the communication, didn't verify through feedback that the person listening or not listening didn't really understand. They didn't get the full expectations, or they didn't do it. Or maybe he's communicating to his team and finding that they don't actually have the technical knowledge to use the software that he's asking them to prepare a presentation in. So he has to go in and he fixes it himself or herself when it's delivered every time, because that one doesn't know how to do that. Well, that means you've given them a job that they're not competent in. And it works the same in manufacturing or the laboratory or the warehouse. When you ship something, one person always gets this bit wrong. Okay, so what do you do about it? Oh, you put an extra check in, somebody else at the end to make sure it's done. That's covering up the lack of competence in the job. What you really should be doing is, when something goes wrong, you look for the root cause. Why is it not working? Maybe the system that you've got in place that you've developed is not adequate. Maybe the training's not good enough. Maybe you've got a checklist there that's got 3 steps missing. And they remember to do all 17 of the ones that are there, but they miss the other 3 because they're just not there. So the procedure you've got in place works. They follow the procedure. They've had the training. They follow the steps in the checklist, but nobody ever gave them the training in the other 3 steps, because the other 3 steps are not in the SOP, but somebody else that's been here for an extra 20 years actually knows about the extra 3 steps that you need to do to get the job right. So is that person that's doing it, that's missing the 3 steps, competent or not? Or is it the system that you've put in place that's a problem? I suggest that it is, because they're competent in what you've trained them in. But because you missed something in the training, because it was missed in the SOP and it was missed in the form, then they're not doing what you need them to do. But somebody else has been there longer, from before you wrote the SOP maybe. He's in there and he's filling in the gap. But he's competent through experience, his knowledge. He's been performing at that level for a long time and hitting the goals that you want him to reach. He's competent. But what happens if you want to change? Well, if those 3 steps that are not documented have to change, how is anybody going to know? And that's why, for me, it's really important that an SOP, a standard operating procedure, or a work instruction has sufficient detail for somebody to do the job. Because if it doesn't, then how are they going to know? What's their reference point? Maybe you gave them a PowerPoint presentation, but what percentage of that presentation do they now remember? Well, when they're not sure, they go back to SOP. And if the SOP and the form don't align with the requirements of what the training was, then they may be competent in the SOP, but not competent in doing the job, performing the role. So you really need to think about what you do when you do a competence assessment. How do you actually define what it is you want them to do? More to the point, or maybe just as important, how do you assess that the knowledge transfer when you did the training works, that it's effective, and how do you demonstrate that they're competent in that role, in performing those duties that you've asked them to do, rather than what some people do is retraining in the SOP that's already absent of what it should be. Go and look at your procedures, go and look at your SOPs, look at your process map. Make sure you actually see that you've done the systems right, that you've created them to reflect what's needed within the business, not what's just needed to meet the regulatory requirements. Because all too often I find people produce an SOP that meets the regulatory requirement, but they don't consider what the business needs. If you don't consider what the business needs, how can it perform? How can you hit those KPIs without somebody's intervention and fixing those 3 steps that nobody actually put into the procedure? So they never train the people that were supposed to do them. So they never develop their competence. And it's only that person that likes to get the recognition for saving the day that knows about it. Well, that's not the way to run a business. That's not the way to develop competence within your team. Make sure you tell them what they need to know. Don't just send them back into training and retraining and retraining every time it goes wrong, just because your system is inadequate. So that's it for me for today. It's Paul Palmer. Talk to you soon.